All right, for the last talk of the morning session, it's wonderful to have Dee Luo here. He's an IAIFI Fellow. He's been with us a couple of years, and he's going to tell you about many body physics meets artificial intelligence.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jin, for the introduction. My name is Dee Luo. I'm currently an IAIFI Fellow at MIT and Harvard. It's my great pleasure to share some of my recent exploration on many body physics and artificial intelligence. So to start with, I mentioned a bit my research interest is lying in this intersection of artificial intelligence, quantum information, and physics. Especially, I found that it's very intriguing and impressive. There's a lot of connection between physics, informations, especially quantum informations, as well as artificial intelligence. And one thing I always very curious is that with this recent year development, there's a lot of new design in artificial intelligence. People build a lot of large models, very fascinating optimizations and learning algorithms. But at the same time, as a very old subject, physics, but also has a lot of insights on nature intelligence. It tells us how nature works, what's the principle of the world. So one thing also very interesting is that how can this nature and artificial intelligence, they all bridge, enhance each other. So can we have a better design or understanding for both the nature and the artificial intelligence? And today I want to share some of the topics along the lines of AI for quantum many-body physics, AI for quantum optimizations, as well as some of the exploration on physics for developing AI. So to start with, I want to introduce this problem of quantum many-body physics simulations, which is a very general research topics ranging in many fields in condensed matter, high energy physics, quantum chemistries. But more generally speaking, there are like two categories of problems. Whenever there's a Hamiltonian is given that describes this many-body system in quantum mechanics, one can ask what's the spectrum of property of such Hamiltonian by solving the eigenstate. Or one can also ask the questions of real-time evolutions of a given Hamiltonian, which also have a lot of interest in physics related to chaos, quantum circuit simulation, dynamics of case theory, for example. But these kind of problems are actually known to be very challenging for two kinds of underlying reasons. One is that they have these very famous side problems, especially when there's a fermion or real-time dynamics. There can be non-positive real numbers or complex number appearing, which it cannot be described by the conventional probability distribution in classical machine learning. There's another very famous problem coming from the curse of dimensionality, where this Hilbert space actually grows exponentially, usually with this number of particles. And if one actually even asks GPT, he also recognized this challenge very precisely, at least from one perspective. He knows that this simulation of many-body physics is a very challenge because of the exponential growth of dimensionality. So people actually spend a lot of efforts trying to tackle these high-dimensional problems. There are many different perspectives. One very famous approach is coming from quantum Monte Carlo. And the high-level idea is to try to use sampling to detect some of the high-dimensional property. So for example, if one to get to some ground state property, one can get these imaginary type evolutions and use some of the techniques of Monte Carlo sampling. So this actually works very well, especially one of the famous examples is the lattice QCD community. Whenever there's no side problems, this approach can get to very precise predictions. But the challenge is that whenever there's a side problems, then this transition probability is no longer transition probability matrix anymore. It can have interference, and then it can cause the sample complexity that scales exponentially. Another very famous approach is coming from some of this tensor method under this name tensor network. In particular, the key idea here is to look for some low-rank tensor decompositions for high-dimensional objects. So one famous example is the MPS, matrix product state. So those kinds of methods are very efficient for low-dimensional systems like a 1D. But then there's still very open research for high dimension like a 2 or 3D, especially the entanglement grows a lot in those contexts. Another very encouraging and very interesting development in this day is the quantum computer. The idea is very natural because all these quantum worlds are very high dimension. So why not we just use naturally high-dimensional machine to handle this. So people have a lot of effort building both analog quantum computer as well as digital quantum computers. And they can be used to simulate both quantum dynamics, also can be used for some ground state problems. But there's also challenge because the current technology still face in this regime of the noisy quantum computer. So to get to high precision calculation, there's still need ongoing efforts. So today I want to discuss some of this advancement on this idea called neural quantum state. The high-level idea here is that actually can we use a neural network to represent such high-dimensional representation? So to give intuitive pictures is that let's consider n particle spin 1/2 systems, which is sitting on this lattice. So these systems actually have like a spin up and down, and one can actually view it as this the game of Go. You have these black and white chess. And then actually for this configuration of n particle actually is a 2 to the n possibility. In this sense, this wave function actually is a 2 to the n vector. So it grows exponentially. Then given this, we found this very encouraging progress in, for example, AlphaGo, you can find this very nice strategy of playing this game. When asked the question, can machine learning also look for what's the optimal spin configuration given these Hamiltonians? So earlier in, I think a few years ago, Khalil and Choya, they first proposed this idea actually to represent this high dimensional wave function according to neural network. So the high level idea is that whenever there's some input configuration, one can pass the neural network and it output the wave function amplitude. And that's also somehow supported by this idea of a universal approximation, and hopefully one can have a compact representation for such high dimensional objects. And later, people also study more on the property of such a new quantum state, and it turns out there's a lot of very interesting and nice features. For example, it can get very high entanglement. Sometimes people call this Wannian law, and it can also have a representation for many different states. And then it can also be allowed to use in the variational simulation for problem, even there's a side problem, which is very hard for the conventional sampling technique. We also have some exploration recently with Jin also here, that we try to understand what's the supervised learning training behavior of such neural network. And we can show that by using this technique of condensed state neural tangent kernel, we can prove its convergence. And actually also very interestingly, we can engineer entanglement property of such neural network technique by using some of this quantum field theory technique of design neural network. That's also related to this NTK and NGP kernel. That's something very nice early in this week discussed. So since it's this proposal, there's also a lot of other explorations along this line. People talk about the representation powers and apply to quantum state tomography, also as well as the simulation of many body systems and quantum chemistries and dynamics as well. So today, actually, I want to talk a bit more on the symmetry perspective of this neural network quantum state. And the first thing I want to discuss is on the anti-symmetry neural network and the fermionic physics that we are able to study based on this development. So one of the key subjects of the fermionic physics is actually lying the Pauli exclusion principle. Or in other words, actually, it talks about this wave function has the property whenever it's changed the position of 2 electrons, it will change the negative sign. So this is a very non-trivial feature because if you just put a black box of neural network and it changes input, that you cannot get a negative sign out of it. So it means that it's not a naive or straightforward way to just have a neural network that fulfills such anti-symmetry property. So achieve that, actually, earlier we designed this idea called neural network backflow, which is inspired by the idea from Feynman in the early 50s, which he is using this idea to dealing with the helium problem. But actually, we generate this idea by further incorporate the machine learning advancement. So the spirit of the backflow actually is coming from the picture that usually in the material with some of our chemistry, we have the mean field orbitals. Those orbitals are good, I mean, have some physics picture, but they cannot capture the correlation effect. So people actually, to capture the correlation effect, they will put some first order question called threshold, and then there's a second question called backflow. And the key idea of the backflow is that instead of a mean field picture, one can have interacting orbitals. When the electron moves, this orbital also changes. And then this anti-symmetry actually is coming from this determinants of these orbitals. The key questions here is that how can one construct this interacting orbital to capture such correlative physics? So what we propose here is that instead of outputting a wave function directly, we are trying to construct the orbital from the neural network backflow transformation. So what it's doing here is that we have the configuration and input to the neural network, and then the network will output a orbital, which we call the neural network orbital, that modify the mean field orbital. And we can show that this orbital actually depends on all the configuration of the electrons, so it captures the many-body effects. And then we put this orbital into the determinant. And the anti-symmetry property actually can be guaranteed from such determinant, because whenever the determinant is changed to rolled, it will get a negative side out of such determinant. So we can actually show that such construction have very nice property, and we can further use it with this variational simulation scheme to lower the energy for such wave function and get the ground state of the problems. And we tested this on a bunch of very challenging model, including Hubbard model, Kagame model, and actually we achieved very good results compared and better than some of the state of the arts. So yeah.
You keep maximizing distance to the microphone.
So one learning step put me further away from the microphone, but good. Yeah, so a question here in terms of the benchmarks, essentially, right? So you show these results. Can you say a little bit on, how much improvement, like how should I think of these?
Yes, so some of these very challenging tasks of including these Hubbard models, which away from half filling, for example, in this 0.875 region, which know that have a very special size structure. And then we also compare this result with for some this state of, for example, DMRG, which is one kind of tensor network result. So we show that as the system grow, actually, we also approach this result very well. Another example is this called the Kagame lattice, of which people sometimes consider some of the spin liquid or whatever. That's also very challenging. Here we also compare to the ED result, and then we find a very nice this linear variance extrapolation, which is a signal that is very close to the ground state as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. And just recap a bit, I think the key message here is that this actually provides a way which one can develop anti-symmetry neural network, and also allows one to change the size structure of these orbitals very directly. And actually, we can also theoretically prove that this scheme can be universal to approximate anti-symmetry functions, and actually naturally realize this hierarchy called Slater threshold backflow hierarchy to make sure at least it's better than the existing hierarchies. And very interesting later, this idea was also further taken step by this very nice advancement in quantum chemistry under the Fermi net and Pauli nets. So that's also a very interesting article. They highlight the connection of this approach. So what is nice is that later the Fermi net and Pauli net, they actually also take this anti-symmetry idea, but generalize to the continuous space.
Yeah, so another question, sorry, about the efficiency of these networks.
Yeah.
How computationally expensive are they?
Oh, yeah, so that's a very good point. So the key complexity is coming from the, one is the complexity of constructing this orbital. Another one is the complexity of taking the determinant. So basically taking the determinant is scale with n to the 3 usually. N is the number of particles. And the construction of the orbitals, the complexity is coming from the neural network complexity. So it depends on the choice of the neural network. But usually usually the neural network complexity does not scale with n to the 3 because even for transformer, sometimes you get n to the 2 only. So roughly that's the complexity. Yeah, so to just also mention a bit more, people later also developed these very powerful techniques on Fermi net and Pauli net for quantum chemistry, which they incorporate the continuous symmetry and then use the determinant, also this neural network backflow idea to get the anti-symmetry function. And actually, they have also a lot of encouraging progress that go beyond the state-of-art methods these days. And recently, we also further extend this to quantum material, especially artificial quantum materials of this rate lattice. We also observe very interesting transitions from these Schrödinger atoms to molecules and have very interesting crystal field effects. So I want to go a bit more. I mean, besides anti-symmetry, I want to also discuss another very important symmetry in physics, which is the gauge symmetries. Especially this plays a very important role in the quantum field series. So instead of just consider like an electron earlier in the many-body physics context, we also need to consider electron, generally the matter field coupled to the gauge fields. And such gauge theory plays a very important role in multiple contexts. For example, in the high energy physics, in the standard model, also in condensed matter, there's a lot of exotic matter physics that relate to gauge theory, like spin liquid or things. And it turns out in quantum information, the quantum error question can also be formulated as a gauge theory language. So that is very important, but we also know that there's a lot of difficulties of studying such theory. Particularly with the gauge field, usually it's a continuous degree of freedom. It has infinite degree of freedom, and you also need to obey a special symmetry, which is called a gauge symmetries. And then this theory sometimes can also couple to fermions. So we also need to take care of the anti-symmetry of the fermion simultaneously. And in particular, it's known that the fermion, because of the exchange statistics we just see earlier, it can create a negative psi whenever exchange two particles. So that creates also the very famous psi problems for fermions. So we know that previously people have a very powerful approach of the Lagrangian formulation of simulating this theory. For example, one is the path integral Monte Carlo, and also there's a very great development in the lattice QCD. And also in this week's talk by Dan and also Fiala's group's work, we also see a lot of very impressive advancement from the flow-based sampling approach. So all those approaches are very nice and fantastic, but at the same time, there's still challenge of the psi problem. In particular, when there's a psi problems, it's non-trivial to just increase the speed of sampling. And there's also a lot of ongoing effort on the directions, but in general, this is a very open area. So today I want to also, instead of focus on the Lagrangian formulation, we can look into the Hamiltonian formulations where it can be used with other techniques. So under these Hamiltonian formulations, people explore this with quantum computer, which also can handle the psi problems, but it's have some limited power at this early stage. People also develop tensor network methods, but this is very challenging to include the infinite degree of freedom, for example, for gauge field, and also is subject to this limitation of high dimensional statistics. And today I want to talk about some of the exploration we have, which is along the line of the new network condensed state, and particular set of the work. We first start with the discrete gauge theory of both abelian and non-abelian group. Later we generalize this to some coupling to fermions, and recently we further have advancement to the pure U1 gauge theory as well as the 2+1D U1 gauge theory coupled to fermion. So give a little bit more context of what this gauge theory look like. So the very simple gauge theory, let's start with the discrete gauge theory. So one example is the G2 gauge theory, which also known as the torical. So basically we have a bunch of this spin living on this edge, but that's a special gauge symmetry, which in physics people also call it Gauss law. So that's an operator we call AV here, which roughly speaking, these spins, they are not independent of each other. This spin configuration, they need to fulfill some constraint specified by this Gauss law operator. And then one can further generalize this G2 gauge theory to continued gauge theory. So one of the examples is the U1 pure gauge theory, which is the quantum version of the Maxwell like a ENN theory we know classically. And there, each of the particles on or this gauge field on this link actually is a U1 variable. It's an infinite degree of freedom. Again, it has a Gauss law, which is specified by this operator called GV, which means that these continued variables are not independent of each other. So one can take a further step, which is to couple this U1 gauge theory with fermions. So now on this vertex of this lattice, that's our matter field, which is labeled by this black dot. So now this matter field and the gauge field, they need to specify a further constraint together. And also this fermion have the anti-symmetry as well as the psi problem. So some of our work to start with, to give a little bit more context here, is that let's consider this G2 gauge theory. So the language here is that there's some Hamiltonian, and the gauge symmetry can be manifest as a Gauss law operator we call GV. And then the GV actually is commute with the Hamiltonian H. So what we need to do is that we need to solve, for example, the spectrum of such Hamiltonian subject to this Gauss operator, which reads as GV acting on this side is equal to psi. So this is a symmetry constraint. In other words, can we construct a function psi such that the psi where this GV acting on configuration is equal to psi s. So the principle we take here is utilize this idea called equivariant principle, and that's also a very nice talk by Tess and Robin in this week's talks. So the key idea here is that we can construct the invariant functions, which is invariant under these gauge transformations, and then we can also construct equivariant function which commute with this gauge symmetry operator. So one important feature here is that unlike, for example, the E3 networks or other, usually the symmetry we talk about in more classical context, which is the global symmetry, for example, globally translational symmetry or rotational symmetry, the gauge symmetry actually is symmetry acting locally. So we always have this index V, which is a vertex index which means that every place is transformed differently. So one example to construct such gauge equivariant feature is that we can utilize the physics insight by this idea called Wilson loop or Wilson curve. So I'll omit some of the details here, but in short, in some of the work here, we actually propose a general framework to construct gauge equivariant neural network for quantum lattice model, which can be applied to both abelian and non-abelian discrete group, and also extended to the key type DG models, the flat-tone ground state, as well as the toricles in arbitrary dimensions. And later we further generalize this to the continued gauge group. So we actually developed this for the continuous U1 pure gauge series. We also achieve very nice comparison compared to the existing method, which is the complex Gaussian method. And to couple this to the fermion, we actually developed another scheme which we use this gauge invariant and anionic symmetry autoregressive neural network. So the autoregressive neural network means that one can rewrite a function into some conditional functions. And actually this conditional function has some nice property because many of these gauge symmetries are local. So we can actually use the autoregressive construction to encode such local property. And this scheme is very general. It does not only allow us to impose gauge symmetry, but also to impose other algebraic constraints. So one example is the anion symmetry. So we know that for boson, there's a fermion, but there's also other exotic particle called anion. When you exchange these two anion, you're not getting a negative or positive one, but you can get a phase. So this scheme we can also utilize to compute like an anion central charge, which we have very nice agreement with the conformal field theory predictions. We can also use it to simulate the 1+1D quantum electrodynamics in real time. And we recently take a further step, which we can generate the scheme to the 2+1D lattice gauge theory, quantum electrodynamics theory, and finite density using this idea called flow wave functions. So here we are not able to deal with gauge field, which is completely U1 degree freedom without cutoff. We impose the Gauss law that coupled to the fermions, and also we can do sampling using the flow-based model directly. And in this context, actually, I have the psi problem, and it turns out that we can also simulate this theory even if psi problems. So we observe also a lot of interesting physics, such as spring breaking and confinements, charge crystal phase transition, and the magnetic phase transition using this approach. One more thing I want to talk about a bit. So previously, all the discussion on the lattice gauge theory, but actually we also have some attempt recently to go to the continued quantum field theory, which we don't have lattice anymore. So this is in collaboration with John, who is one of, I think, attended these workshops, and he also gave a talk earlier. The high level idea is that we actually further propose a neural quantum field theory to continue quantum field, such that we can apply to many of these elite linear model, CS model, and the regularized Klein-Golden model, and achieve very good agreements with many of the calculations. So now I want to talk a little bit more on the next topic is, besides the ground state property I mentioned more earlier, we want to switch this context to the quantum dynamics. And it turns out this has actually a lot of connection to the high dimensional PDE research, which we also found very interesting because while we develop this tool for quantum dynamics, it turns out it can also be applied to the quantum, the high dimensional PDE. So one question motivates this research at the starting point is that can we convert our quantum world as close as possible to a classical world? And the key idea observation here is that in quantum mechanics, we talk about wave functions, and then we talk about how it evolves through unitary or quantum channels. But then we also have a classical world, which the key object is the probability distributions, and then how it evolves maybe is following the stochastic process. or a quasi-stochastic process. So what we are doing here is that we try to develop a series scheme that to map our quantum world as close as possible to a classical world, such that many of these powerful tools in classical machine learning now can be utilized to describe our quantum world. So one of these actually can be realized is through this quantum tomography idea, which is called the positive operator value measurement, POVM. So this actually historically, philosophically, also very interesting, related to this idea called quantum Bayesian. So basically, when asked this question, whether we can get all the information of a quantum world through measurements. The standard projective measurement does not allow us to do that, but this POVM is possible. So basically, it says that once people do this quantum tomography use POVM, actually can convert the density matrix in quantum mechanics to the probability distribution without the loss of informations. So by utilizing this key scheme and idea, actually we develop a mathematically exact mapping to convert, for example, the very general Schrödinger equation, or actually here is the Liouville equations in open quantum systems to the probability differential equations, which the key object here is the probability P, and then in a high dimensional context, this actually becomes a high dimensional PDE. So now instead of solving the original Schrödinger or the Liouville equation, we can now solve the high dimensional probability differential equations. So to achieve that, we develop different scheme. For example, we can study the dynamics of such system by generalizing the standard low dimensional forward backward numerical PDE scheme to high dimensional context by using like the stochastic optimization. So one scheme we develop is called the forward backward scheme, which we can have a transformer to represent such high dimensional probability distribution at time t, which we call the PT. And then we want to look for the future representation of such probability distribution, which we call the PT plus 2 tau. And then we can do a forward and backward evolution simultaneously and define the loss function that should agree at the place where t plus tau. So we can minimize this loss function step by step, and then to push forward this dynamics. We can also solve the static state of such high dimensional PDE directly by minimizing the loss of this operator. So here, I want to also reveal a bit of the insight here is that by having this formulation, actually we can now view quantum particle as some kind of language, because they both now described by some probability distribution, especially it's a high dimensional distribution with long range correlations. So we also studied this in the context of quantum circuit earlier. But here the key is that once of this formulation, we are now able to use very powerful machine learning tool, for example, transformer, to parameterize such high dimensional distribution of quantum particle. And this actually also can capture many important long range effects, as this paper say attention is all you need. Maybe you just need more attention to capture all these quantum correlations. And then this also allows for exact sampling and inference as well. So it's very powerful. So we test this scheme actually on multiple different quantum open systems, and actually will achieve very good results, even better than some of the early work on the density matrix. By a restricted Boltzmann machine, we can do dynamics in 1D and 2D. Very recently, we also generate this to continuous variables by using the flow-based models. We actually call this idea called the Q-flow, which we use the generative modeling for differential equations of open quantum system using normalizing flow. So here, we also have a standard Liouville density matrix evolution by using this reformulation of the Husumi Q function in quantum optics. We are able also to convert the continuous bosonic quantum world into a quasi probability world, which looks like a classical probability distribution. And we use normalizing flow to solve these high dimensional differential equations. And also we achieve very good result, and even better than the existing method that one can handle. And we also found this very interesting to the ICML community. So this can be further generalized to other contexts as well. And one more thing we want to talk about is that actually we further also explore this idea. Just besides solving this tie step by step, we may also ask the question, can we solve the whole space-time of such high dimensional PDE? So here we also developed this idea called the space-time neural network for high dimensional quantum dynamics, where, for example, solve such Schrödinger equation, we have both space and time. Then now we can actually construct a space-time neural network, not just represent the state, but there's also an internal time network can represent the time. So now we can optimize the space and time simultaneously to get a space path for such PDE. So this is also something we found interesting and could be further explored as well. So this concludes a little bit on my this sharing on the physics and quantum many-body physics, especially with AI. So today, next, I want to just briefly talk a bit more on some of this AI for content on the perspective of quantum information science. So one thing we also explore is that there's a lot of topics, I mean, in these days.
Sorry to slow you down on the previous one, but can you say a little bit more on the examples that you can apply this to and or have applied this to? So
which one?
Next slide.
Next one.
No, this, the space-time.
Yeah, so this one can be also applied to different like spin model dynamics, like a Heisenberg model, transverse field Ising models, and so it's a very general scheme.
But in 1D and
1D, 2D, yeah, both are applicable. Yeah.
Could you just in this case comment again on the architecture quickly? I mean, it sounds like you're using a neural network to solve the time-dependent Schrodinger equation, which is very natural. What architectural choices did you make here that were critical?
Oh yeah, it's critical that here usually what people do is that they only for each tie step they have a one neural network. This is also what we do previously, but now here actually we want to create a family of neural networks that also have the tie dependence. So here, actually, what we do is that we have two networks. One's the external spatial network, which is the autoregressive network. In this case, with the transformer. But there's another internal temporal network that specifies each tie step what this transformer can behave. So that is something like with a transformer, but then there's another neural network that outputs the way of the transformer to be tie dependent. So now these two networks together becomes a space-time neural network together, can represent a family of neural network.
Thanks.
So this actually we also found to have a this interesting connection to like this neural operator things in this context, because now we are not just solving a particular function, but actually a family of functions. So that's one thing we want to also explore. So come to this next topic of the quantum information. We actually also explored the different topics. One interesting we found is that there's a lot of interesting important problem in quantum control, where with the feedback information, the device is content, but the question is that can we come up with some nice protocol to control subsystem? So one question is that, for example, in the topological quantum computing context, people want to braid these particles, and the question is how to braid it actually is very open. So here we actually developed some of this differentiable programming technique to come up with very new protocol that people do not know before. Later, we also find that this is physically reasonable by using the physics analysis. But today I want to focus on more one of also the recent attempt we try to do for quantum optimization.
Real quick, can you say you said braid, right?
Yeah.
What braiding problem are you trying to solve?
Oh yeah, so in general we have this braiding of this anion on these things, which can allow us for universal quantum computing. But here we are not particularly solving the braiding problems, but instead is that when you braid this particle, you need to consider the context of the environment, the coherence. So you cannot braid too fast, because if braid too fast, you will destroy this particle, given that's a critical velocity related to gap of the system. Yeah.
I see. So the control problem is sort of how often to braid subject to the constraint of maintaining coherence.
Yes, the question is that the ideal case, we want to braid adiabatically slow, but it's too slow, then it will be destroyed by the noise of the environment. We braid too fast, that is destroyed by the physics. So we need to choose the optimal braiding scheme, like the speed of how to braid this particle, given the length and the time we have.
Are the specific braid actions sort of part of the action space, or is it just whether or not to braid?
It is on the action. So we have this phase diagram F actually, which is related to the distance to braid and the time that allow to braid. So if we have a very long time, we can do like adiabatic protocol. But the question is that if we have a relatively short time and long distance, what should we do? So this is an unknown question before. And then actually by differential programming, we come up with a jump protocol. Basically, we should move very fast and then make it to be roughly like a linear speed. Yeah, so maybe let me just
as moderator, I'll just say you've got about 10 minutes, including questions.
Yeah. Is this thing not working? And maybe let me just briefly mention a bit on this several exploration we have. So one thing is on this content optimizations. So on quantum computer this day, people also develop quantum computer for many of these problems in optimizations. One interesting thing is that unlike classical optimization, people can do gradient calculation very easily, which basically based on this automatic differentiation and backward propagation, one can get like a O1 complexity. The content optimization is much more costly because what happened due to the measurements that you need to do like a parameter shift rule or something, which actually scale with the number of parameter, even when you take gradient. So that means that you are much more costly on quantum computer to take gradient. And the question now is that can we actually speed up such process? And this actually turns out to be a very interesting connection with the Koopman theory developed in the 30s. So in the old days, Koopman tried to ask these questions: can we solve classical problems using quantum mechanics? And then it developed this Koopman theory, which says that one can convert a classical nonlinear PDE to a high-dimensional quantum PDE. So this is the insight we have, because now this quantum optimization problem is also like a nonlinear PDE. So what we can do is that can we use this Koopman operator theory to lift this gradient quantum optimization problem to a high-dimensional space such it becomes linear. And once it becomes linear, then we can predict the gradient directly. So it turns out it's also a very interesting connections here with the quantum natural gradient as well as the quantum imaginary time evolution. So what happens that the high-level idea is that for many of these quantum optimization problems, it can correspond to a quantum imaginary time evolution, which the long time limit it gives runs to this ground state. And it turns out this quantum imaginary time evolution actually is a dynamical system. So that also can induce something we call the quantum natural gradients, as well as this quantum fictional information. So now what I want to say here is that the Koopman operator theory actually can lift this optimization problem to this high dimension PDE in quantum imaginary time evolution, and that is also connected to the quantum natural gradient. So with this picture in mind, we know that this linearization of predicted gradient could be potentially happens whenever we have the quantum natural gradient as well as the over-parameterization context. So basically what we do is that we can first collect a few gradients on the quantum computer, and then we put it to the Koopman operator learning to lift up to a high dimensional space, and then to predict the rest of the gradient directly. And the prediction of the gradient is much cheaper than measuring gradient on quantum computer, because the prediction just need O1 verifications. So we test these schemes actually on multiple different regimes and with different optimization, and we found that it can achieve speed ups quite like a nice need for many of these contexts, from 10 factors of speed up to like a 200 factor speed ups, depending on different contexts. And we also apply this to many different systems, including quantum chemistry, condensed matter, and quantum machine learning to accelerate the content optimization, also using this idea of the Koopman learning. So finally, I want to also briefly share a bit on this physics for AI advancement. So what we recently do is on this generative models with physics process. So this is also in collaboration with Ziming, Liu, Tommy, Yishu, and Max Tedma. So here, actually, the key idea is that we have also very nice talk this week on like a diffusion models, and turns out this diffusion model is highly related to the heat equations, and there's also this recent development on Poisson float, which is actually related to the electrostatic. And then we ask these questions. There's also a lot of other physics PDE, for example, with the wave equation, the Helmholtz equation, the Yukawa potential Schrödinger equation. So can we all convert these different physics PDE to a generative model? So here we develop a general scheme and framework to converting and designing generative model from physics process. So one example here we analyze is the this diffusion model, Poisson equations, as well as, for example, ideal equation, dissipative equation. So we come up with different criteria when this equation can be converted to generative model and what's the features they have. Another interesting exploration we recently have is that can we also design robots planning using the physics principle. And in particular, we're very interested in this thing called the multi-legged robots. So usually people like these 4-leg robots, they can run very fast. But in nature, there's also this multi-legged robot, like they have the 6-leg, which is the head support. We have the 12-leg with the centipede. So there's a lot of robot with a lot of different legs. And then the interesting thing is that once you have many legs, then your motion can have a lot of choice because you can move your leg very differently. Right? So you have basically the choice of locomotion grows somehow roughly exponentially with the number of your leg. So that's actually very like the statistical mechanic or the spin model. So here we design a general like a spin model duality as a framework to study this robot planning of multi-leg context. And very interesting, you also discover new optimal locomotion protocol, for example, for this head support in the real robot experiment. So the high level idea here is that we have this robot planning and we have a mapping to the spin model. And then we can solve this spin model very efficiently now. And then, for example, we can get this head support forward motion. So this is a 6-leg robot, they can move forward. We found that this in the experiment, it can come up with a new protocol that's better than the existing biophysics protocol. And we can also design robot that not move forward, but move sidewards. It's very strange. It's like a crab or something. You move horizontally, right? So this is called a side swing motion that does not exist before for head support, but we can also design such optimal movement using the statistical physics principle. Which is very new. So just conclude my talk today, I want to talk about this very exciting new opportunity for both AI and many body physics and quantum information science. But at the same time, also there's very new opportunity for physics contributing to AI. So with the hope that we can also develop both artificial and nature intelligence together. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Other questions for Dee? Marisa, do you want to handle the back of the room and I'll handle the front? Well, that's not very fair, actually, looking at the distribution.
For the work that used natural evolutionary strategies, what made that the natural choice as opposed to some other sort of zero order optimizer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We also try other zeros order methods like a symmetry or annealings. It turns out the natural evolution here, I think, has a little bit more advantage by connecting to this natural gradient. It's like a noisy version of it. So we found that in practice, it's also have better performance than symmetry annealing.
Other questions for Dee? Dee, could you pull up your GenPhys slide?
Yeah.
So it's kind of amazing how many papers you presented in this talk. I'm trying to, so this is a really interesting idea, and I'm curious what the little lock boxes mean at the bottom, and then how it correlates with the red X's and the green checks. I mean, which ones of these work? Do you have intuition for when some are better than others, etc.? I mean, it's sort of a natural idea, but I don't think I got many takeaways that I'm supposed to take away from which particular processes work and so forth.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Yeah, sorry for the brief mentioning on these topics. It's very interesting. I think zooming also in this workshop, people can also discuss together. We have a lot of ideas forward as well. But the long story short is that we have a special criteria in this work, especially we call the S generative. This is only a subfamily of all this general model. And what this S generative means is the smooth generative. So that means that we hold this generative model in the infinite norm regime, it becomes like a uniform or smooth distribution. So that's the criteria. So this yes or no is only saying whether this PDE can get to this smooth generative criteria. So the picture here is that because in diffusion model, when you go to very long time, you get back to this uniform noise, and this Poisson flow have the same picture. Here, by this green check or not, we're saying that, for example, if this Yukawa thinks that you are actually able to get this S generated, this question mark is that saying that under some condition, the Helmholtz equation is able to do it, some condition does not. The Schrödinger equation, the wave, we put a cross there. It does not mean that it cannot be a generative model. It just means that it does not fulfill the S generated. The reason is because the wave equation, unlike the heat equation, actually preserve information. right? So that means that the information can translate infinite long, so it cannot be smoothed out. So that's the only meaning here. But actually, it's a separate open question, because even though it does not smooth out, it can still be used as a generative model, because you can change, like if a pool of water, you want to change one distribution to another distribution, you're still able to do so, even though they does not smooth out. So this all this what means is that there's the potential to unlock all these different equations. But we do have further, for example, very interesting example. We can actually to bridge this diffusion model and the Poisson flow together by interpolating these two differential equations into one, and that could also have some better performance than one of it.
Putting them into some combined model where they restrict to one or the other on a hyperplane.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And is there a case where I should use Yukawa versus Poisson versus diffusion? Is there a sense of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the Yukawa here actually is very interesting because it introduced a mass, right, in the context, where if you turn the mass to 0, then you recover one of these model before. So we also have a toy experiment to study that whether there's some benefit of including the mass on the Yukawa, and then it seems that sometimes it helps, sometimes it does not help. So it's still an open questions. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's thank Dee one more time.